The case of George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin captured national attention because of the politically charged nature of the murder itself, with some saying it was self-defense on the behalf of Zimmerman and others saying it was a cold-blooded murder motivated by racism because Trayvon Martin was a young black man and was profiled by Zimmerman. Many claiming the shooting was motivated by racism would not only categorize this case as a criminal homicide but also a hate crime, and others standing by Zimmerman's claim of self-defense. Everyone in the nation chose a side, and the proceedings lasted 3 weeks. Trayvon Martin was born February 5, 1995, and was a 17-year-old African-American high school student who lived in Miami Gardens, Florida. Martin was killed while visiting his father by George Zimmerman after receiving a 10-day suspension from his high school. Trayvon was simply a young man walking home from a local 7-Eleven late at night after purchasing Skittles. He was not carrying a weapon. However, he did have traces of cannabis in his blood. But when you look behind the appearance of the menacing teenager, you find a child inside. On these grounds of the fact that Trayvon was a harmless black teenager, Zimmerman was accused of being motivated by racism and having racially profiled Martin. During early media coverage of the incident, Zimmerman's call to the police dispatcher was misleadingly edited by NBC, so it appeared that Zimmerman volunteered Trayvon Martin's race. It was later discovered he did not do this. Mr. Zimmerman was a neighborhood watch volunteer, claimed that he shot Mr. Martin only after the teenager assaulted him, and used the concrete sidewalk as a weapon to damage Mr. Zimmerman's head, in which case Zimmerman then shot Trayvon in self-defense, who was leaning over him when he was killed. Whether the events that transpired were a premeditated hate crime that ended in the homicide of a young black man or the actions of a scared neighborhood watch member who was assaulted after approaching a suspicious hooded man at night, an altercation ensued regardless that ended in a death, and all the indicators of Lukenbill's criminal homicide as a transaction occurred. Lukenbill examined 70 transactions that ended in murder, and in all cases, the murder was a culmination of an interchange between an offender and a victim. Criminal homicide is a collective transaction. An offender, victim, and possibly an audience engage in an interchange which leaves the victim dead. The transactions always take place in a sequential form. The victim, what offender deemed an offensive move. The offender typically retaliated with a verbal or physical challenge, and a working agreement is made. In this case, the working agreement was made when the 911 dispatcher told Zimmerman not to follow him, but he proceeded to, and assumed Trayvon was threatening. In the case of the homicide, that the offender and the victim are heuristic labels for the statuses that are either emerge in the transaction or an artifact of the battle. In 71% of cases, the status of offender and victim are determined by one's statement of intent to kill or injure the other. Stage 1. The opening move in the transaction was an event performed by the victim and subsequently defined by the offender as an offense to the face. In this case, George Zimmerman seeing Martin walking home and following him was that first step. The second, ending in murder that offended the victim, previous move as a personally offensive. And the third step, the offender issued an expression of anger and contempt which signified the opinion of the victim as an unworthy person. The transaction in some cases, though, the offender often interpreted, sometimes incorrectly, the victim's move to implicitly agreement to violence. In this case, Trayvon ignored the warning to stop and assaulted Zimmerman, bashing his head against the sidewalk in what witnesses say he used as a weapon. The offender, in many cases, the victim appeared committed to the battle. The reputations here were George Zimmerman, the neighborhood watchman, and Trayvon, a teen who had no intention or inclination to comply with Zimmerman. So Zimmerman secured the weapon and dropped the victim in a single shot. Once the victim had fallen, the offender made one of three moves. In this case, Zimmerman waited for the police and was taken into custody. Lukenbill also discusses bystanders and their effect on the homicide. Bystanders assumed one of three roles: hostile, neutral, and supportive. In this case, some agreed with the narrative Zimmerman was telling, that he was assaulted when he stopped to question the young man and killed him in self-defense. A young hooded man being out at night, and when Martin ran, he caught him and assaulted him and simply shot him out of personal bias towards crime in his neighborhood is the other side of the argument. The two sides of the coin came to fruition in court, with narratives being spun by witnesses on both sides, with those who were witnesses for Trayvon's side backing up the story that Zimmerman was a racist and perpetrated his hate crime, and other witnesses backing up Zimmerman's story of self-defense. The only common thread of all the accounts are the simple and disputed facts, as opposed to the nature of the death itself. There was an altercation, a man was killed, and a criminal investigation followed, and Zimmerman was charged with second-degree murder. Due to the highly politicized nature of this case, and on the basis of hate and racism, as well as the massive news coverage by every major news network, there was fake news, deceptive editing, and unfavorable portrayals of both parties. Based on the logic of Lukenbill's case, this falls into criminal homicide as a transaction theory rather well. Every stage is very clear and occurrence on his transactional approach to explaining homicide. The overall biases in this case were perpetrated on all sides, with accusations being made against Zimmerman was accused of being motivated by racism and of having racially profiled Martin. An individual's viewpoint on the bias in this case dictated their view on the outcome, and whether the verdict was right, and this was a case of self-defense or simply a case of homicide that had been boiled down to a non-criminal death. This case captivated the nation. This case definitely has all the transactional events needed to make it a criminal homicide, but society has stated that it isn't criminal by acquitting George Zimmerman. However, that can clearly be contested based on varying eyewitness accounts, differing evidence, and also individuals' general outlook on racism.